job. And the measure of grace was the ability to speak from the heart to the heart and win the people's hearts and minds for Jesus. The life of the circuit rider was physically grueling. They traveled, usually by horseback, with little more than the clothes that they were wearing through all kinds of weather. On the frontier, where conditions were primitive, there were stories of preachers who sometimes declined the offer of a bed and slept out of doors to avoid the fleas and the bed bugs. Illness and accident were constant perils. At the beginning of the 19th century, about 1 in 6 of the circuit riders died on the circuit. Special hymns were sung at the end of the preacher's visit that would commend him to God's care in case he didn't make it back again. Wow. But by the end of the 1840s, the movement's growth rate was slowing dramatically, about the time that American churches were building substantial buildings. Paul Nixon notes that there's a real correlation between the steady slowdown of the Methodist movement's expansion and the steady construction of substantial church buildings. And he makes this prophetic declaration. He says, the more building-oriented any church becomes, the more it will be tempted to take on the settled attitudes and habits of an institution and to leave the free-spirited, frontier-oriented attitudes and practices that grew it to begin with. It's fascinating to study the historical record and to see how many churches and how many denominations share this narrative arc of tremendous growth followed by tremendous decline. Just this week, a small group sat in my office on Tuesday, and several longtime members recalled the origins of this church. A story recalled in a wonderful booklet that I've got in my office. For those of you who remember, a special book, that booklet that was put out with pictures at the church's 75th anniversary. I love the way the story begins, and let me read it to you. Along the muddy, unpaved roads of the Highlands, in the bleak winter of 1922, a few resolute people trudged past cornfields and apple orchards to reach religious services in scattered homes and to take children to Sunday school in an old barn. I love that. I love the image of Sunday school in the old barn with the hayloft up above. I guess that had been converted to classrooms. This was the beginning of the church in the Highlands. The square mile of Highlands farmlands grew since 1922 into a microcosm of middle-class suburbia until every street became paved and scarcely a lot was left without an attractive house and a landscaped lawn. The new church was named the Greenridge Congregational Church, a name that stuck until 1930. The old barn behind the home of Thomas Burney at 151 Longview, no longer needed for horses and cows, was converted for Sunday school use. An overhead hayloft accommodated some of the classes. When news of the new congregation seeped through the city, a local newspaper editorialized. Here's what they said about us, and I quote, "There's a little church up our way, urged on by zestful earnestness that has shown itself to be contagious in the community." That, friends, is the frontier spirit. Does that sound like a fortress to you? That sounds frontier to me. Sadly, too many churches have now settled into a fortress mentality with big, imposing buildings built in another age that look impenetrable. They look, in fact, like impenetrable castles to many people, many neighbors walking by. On Tuesday morning, our study group took the fortress test. We're asked to answer true or false to questions like these. Ponder these as I read them. Less than 6 persons a year join our church from within a mile of the church building. True or false? Less than 6 persons a year join our church from within a mile. All doors to our church building are locked during weekdays, even if some have an intercom and buzzer. There are warning signs posted on our church property for any of the following. Take the test. Skateboarding, loitering, unauthorized parking, trespassing on the playground. You know, I actually visited a church. I won't tell the city. It was a sister UCC church. And I knew a new pastor had come to town for that church because they had taken all the no trespassing, no soliciting signs off the doors. And it had become a more welcoming church. Here's one. The major outdoor doors from the street to our church's worship space have no windows to see inside. There is an opposing tower or steeple attached to the church building. True or false? Our facilities are closed for business most of the time during the weekday. 90% of church group gatherings and ministries are held inside the building as opposed to elsewhere in the community. True or false? How about this one? The church phone number sends me to an answering machine during daytime hours. None of our weekly worship services, the question asked, specializes in a style of music that many neighborhood people under the age of 40 or 50 would listen to on their radios or electronic devices. True or false? The official church sign on the street offers no specific invitation to specific events. Invites you only to worship services. True or false? Well, we took the test that day in my office, and we didn't fare so well. We did okay on some questions. There were other questions that I didn't read. But we didn't do so well, I'm sorry to say. Like so many churches, our church, it seems, is in danger of slipping into a fortress mentality. Holed up in a fortress, oblivious to the neighborhoods around us. The problem, Paul Nixon says, is that our buildings have become idols and albatrosses. Our buildings are at once the single greatest asset on paper that we have, but also can become a liability, preventing us from nimbleness. But it wasn't always so. As that little clip from the paper demonstrates, we were once called by the local newspaper zestfully earnest. Zestfully earnest. And a contagious force in the community. People were infected by the church in the Highlands. We were in the bloodstream. We were a vital part of neighborhoods and communities. And we worshiped, I just love this, we worshiped and did Sunday school in a barn. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go try to do that again. But here is a question for us. Even though we currently worship in a beautiful Gothic fortress with lovely stained glass windows all around us containing 7,000 pieces of rare glass and 1,500 pounds of lead made by Montague Castle, a master craftsman who studied the famous windows of the Chartres Cathedral in France. Here's the question. Can a fortress church go back to having that frontier spirit that it possessed at its startup? Even if you keep the building, keep the fortress, can you nevertheless have a change in the way you think about